On the afternoon of May 17, 1875, in front of approximately 10,000 spectators gathered on the rough, open land of what would later be called Churchill Downs in Louisville, Kentucky, a small chestnut 3-year-old colt named Aristides crossed a finish line. He was ridden by a black jockey named Oliver Lewis. He had won the first Kentucky Derby. The purse was $2,850. The race had been run before. Some version of 2 horses crossing a defined distance with money riding on the outcome has been run on every continent humans inhabit for at least 4,000 years. The Kentucky Derby was not the first horse race. It was not the most prestigious in 1875. It was not even the most important race held in America that year, but it became, eventually, the centerpiece of a multi-billion-dollar global industry and the prototype of every televised gambling spectacle that would follow. Here is what almost no one watching that first derby understood. The colt Aristides did not exist as a random act of breeding. He was the deliberate genetic product of a project that had been running, with mathematical patience, for 170 years. Every other horse running that day at Churchill Downs was a product of the same project, and every Kentucky Derby winner since, every Triple Crown champion, every horse worth millions at stud, every animal moving through the auction rings at Saratoga or Newmarket today, descends, without exception, from 3 stallions that were imported into England between roughly 1680 and 1730. 3 horses, 1 captured in a war, 1 traded for rifles, 1 found pulling a cart through the streets of Paris. This is the story of horse racing, but more honestly, it is the story of how a sport that began as a Bronze Age display of military prowess became, by the 21st century, one of the most genetically narrow, financially concentrated, and politically protected gambling industries on Earth. The horses run. The money moves. The bloodlines that built the modern racetrack were assembled by a handful of Englishmen who could not possibly have understood what they were starting. It does not start in Kentucky. It does not start at Newmarket. It starts in a dust bowl in central Rome, in the long shadow of the Palatine Hill, 2,000 years before any English nobleman ever conceived of importing a horse. The Circus Maximus was an open valley between the Palatine and Aventine Hills, roughly 621 meters long and 150 meters wide. In its final imperial form, it could seat approximately 150,000 spectators, a number that would not be exceeded by any single sporting venue until the construction of the Strahov Stadium in Prague in the 20th century. At the height of the Roman Empire, racing days at the Circus Maximus drew crowds large enough to require the closure of the surrounding markets. The races themselves were chariot races. 4 horses harnessed abreast, 12 chariots typically running at once, 7 laps around a central spine called the spina, on a course so narrow that the inner chariots were essentially scraping the wall. The fatalities, on both ends of the harness, were routine. What is striking, looking back at the Roman chariot circuit, is how recognizable the institutional architecture is. The chariots ran in 4 colored factions: the reds, the whites, the blues, and the greens, each with its own stable, its own trainers, its own corporate funding, and its own dedicated fan base. The blues and the greens, by the imperial period, had become political constituencies. Roman emperors openly favored one color or another. Crowd violence between fans of different factions was a recurring feature of Roman urban life. The historian Alan Cameron, in his 1976 monograph Circus Factions, documented how the blue-green rivalry shaped political affiliations across the entire eastern half of the empire for nearly 500 years. The most extreme expression of this is the Nika riots of January 532 in the Hippodrome of Constantinople. The Hippodrome was the Eastern Roman Empire's direct architectural inheritor of the Circus Maximus. A dispute among the factions during a regular racing day escalated, within 48 hours, into a city-wide uprising against the Emperor Justinian. The fires set during the riot destroyed roughly half of Constantinople. When the imperial troops finally restored order, approximately 30,000 people had been killed inside the Hippodrome itself. Justinian's wife Theodora, by most surviving accounts, is the reason he did not flee the city. The dead were left where they fell for several days. 30,000 people killed at a race meeting. That number is worth holding in mind, because everything that the modern Western mind associates with horse racing, the elegance, the carnations on the necks of the winners, the women in hats at Royal Ascot, sits on top of an inheritance that, in its origin, was indistinguishable from organized political violence. Racing was never separate from money, faction, and power. Racing was money, faction, and power, organized into laps. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. The chariot factions disappeared. For 1,000 years, between roughly the 5th century and the 15th, there is no continuous record of organized horse racing in Europe at any meaningful scale. Knights jousted. Tournaments happened. Hunting on horseback was a noble sport, but the spectator and betting model of the Circus Maximus did not survive the Middle Ages in any institutional form. It was reinvented in England almost by accident in the 17th century, and the man who set it in motion was a king who had spent his entire adult life trying to recover the throne his father had been beheaded for losing. Charles II of England returned from exile in 1660. He had spent the previous decade travelling Europe, France, the Spanish Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, and he had developed, during those years, a particular fondness for the small market town of Newmarket in Suffolk, east of Cambridge, which his grandfather James I had used as a hunting retreat. After his restoration to the throne, Charles essentially relocated the English court to Newmarket for several months of every year. He raced his own horses. He bet heavily on the outcomes. He commissioned the first formal racetrack constructed in England since Roman times. The contemporary diarist John Evelyn recorded Charles at Newmarket as appearing more relaxed there than at any official function in London. The nickname, the Sporting King, was given to him during his lifetime. By the 1680s, Newmarket had become the central node of an emerging national racing calendar, and English gentry across the country were beginning to import Arabian and Turkish stallions in an effort to breed faster horses for the Newmarket course. 3 of those imports, between 1680 and roughly 1730, would change the genetics of horse racing forever. The first was a war horse. Captain Robert Byerley, an English cavalry officer, captured a dark bay Turkish stallion at the Battle of Buda in 1686 during the Habsburg siege of the Ottoman-occupied Hungarian capital. The horse travelled with him back to England, then to Ireland with the army during King William's War, then to retirement at Captain Byerley's estate in Yorkshire. The horse covered relatively few English mares. He died around 1703, but his bloodline, through his descendant Herod, would become one of the 3 foundational sire lines of the modern thoroughbred. The horse was given the name Byerley Turk, and he is the oldest of the 3 founders. The second of his English children, a colt called Jig, sired Partner, who sired Tartar, who sired Herod. Every Herod line racehorse in the world today, including the 18th century English champion Highflyer and the modern French champions sired by Jebel, traces in a direct, unbroken male line back to a horse captured by a Yorkshire captain at a battle outside Budapest in 1686. The second arrived in 1704. His name was the Darley Arabian, and the story of how he got to England reads like an early prototype of a modern arms for resources deal. Thomas Darley was an English merchant and diplomatic agent stationed in Aleppo, Syria. At the time, a major trading hub on the western edge of the Ottoman Empire. He was, in his off hours, a horse enthusiast. In 1704, he located, on the estate of a Bedouin tribal leader named Sheikh Mirza II, a 4-year-old bay colt of the Muniki Arabian line. The colt was, by Darley's own description in a letter sent home to his brother, immediately striking, owing to his handsome appearance and exceedingly elegant carriage. Darley arranged for the colt's purchase. The transaction is described in one 19th century account, somewhat romantically, as the first arms for horses trade in the modern Middle East, Darley reportedly paying for the stallion in part with a shipment of English rifles. The arrangement was unauthorized by the Sheikh. Darley shipped the horse to England before the seller could object. The horse was installed at Aldby Park, the Darley family estate in Yorkshire, where he stood at stud, almost entirely privately, for the next 26 years. That single stallion, that one bay colt shipped out of Aleppo in 1704 under arguably criminal circumstances, is the direct male line ancestor of approximately 95% of all thoroughbred racehorses alive today. The mechanism by which this happened was Eclipse. Eclipse was a chestnut colt foaled in April 1764 in the village of Cranford, Middlesex, England. He was the great-great-grandson of the Darley Arabian. He raced 18 times in his career and was undefeated. The phrase "Eclipse first, the rest nowhere" was coined during his racing life and remained in English sporting language for over a century. Eclipse retired to stud in 1771. He produced 344 winners, including 3 winners of the Derby. By the early 19th century, his bloodline had absorbed and overwhelmed almost every other thoroughbred lineage then operating. Today, 80% of all thoroughbreds descend directly from Eclipse in the male line, and Eclipse, in his male line, descends directly from a horse that was effectively stolen out of Syria in 1704. The third foundation stallion arrived by a more humiliating route. The Godolphin Arabian was foaled around 1724, probably in Yemen. He was sent, in a series of diplomatic transfers, to the stud of the Bey of Tunis. In 1730, the Bey presented him as a gift to King Louis XV of France. Louis was unimpressed. The horse was small, perhaps 14 hands at the shoulder, and undistinguished in appearance. According to a story that may be apocryphal, but that has been repeated in horse racing literature for almost 300 years, the king consigned the gift to a Parisian cart driver who used the small bay stallion to haul water through the streets of the city. An English horseman named Edward Cook, travelling in Paris in the early 1730s, spotted the cart horse, recognised its breeding, and purchased it. The horse was shipped to England. Cook died in 1733, and the stallion passed to Francis Godolphin, the second Earl of Godolphin, who installed it at his stud at Wandlebury in Cambridgeshire. The horse went on to sire a generation of champions. He was the leading sire of Great Britain and Ireland in 1738, 1745, and 1747. His most famous descendant, the colt Matcham, founded the third of the 3 modern thoroughbred sire lines. The horse is buried under a stone in the courtyard of the Wandlebury stables, where visitors today can still see his grave. So that is the foundation. 3 Arabian and Turkish stallions, imported under conditions ranging from the diplomatic to the openly criminal, all within a window of about 50 years. The Bayali Turk, captured in war. The Darley Arabian, bought in Aleppo with what may have been a crate of rifles. The Godolphin Arabian, found pulling a water cart on the streets of Paris. Every modern thoroughbred descends from one or more of these 3 horses. And in 1750, in a coffee house in Pall Mall, London, a group of wealthy English gentlemen who frequented the Newmarket meetings formed an association to regulate the sport that those 3 stallions had made possible. They called themselves the Jockey Club. They had no legal authority, they had no government charter, they simply began publishing rules, certifying horses, and informally enforcing standards across the English racing calendar. The Jockey Club still exists. It is, in its present form, the world's oldest sporting governing body in continuous operation. Almost everything in the modern global rulebook for thoroughbred racing, the weights, the eligibility ages, the steward's inquiries, the registration of bloodstock, traces in some lineage to decisions made in that Pall Mall coffee house in the second half of the 18th century. The Jockey Club also gave the racing world its 3 foundational stakes races. The St. Leger Stakes, founded in 1776 at Doncaster, the Oaks, founded in 1779 at Epsom Downs, and in 1780, on a spring evening at the Oaks dinner party, 2 members of the Jockey Club, Edward Smith Stanley, the 12th Earl of Derby, and Sir Charles Bunbury, flipped a coin to determine whose name would be attached to a new race they had just agreed to fund. Derby won the toss. The race has been called the Derby ever since. Bunbury, as consolation, owned the colt that won the first running of it the following May. By the end of the 18th century, thoroughbred racing in England had its bloodstock, its rules, its calendar, and its institutional spine. The next 200 years were primarily a process of exporting that infrastructure to the rest of the world. Virginia and Maryland imported the thoroughbred system from England in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Salima tri-Carmel rivalry of the 1750s between mares owned by Maryland and Virginia gentry became the prototype of the great American intersectional rivalries that would mark the sport for the next 2 centuries. After the American Civil War, the center of the American breeding industry migrated west to Kentucky, specifically to the limestone-rich pastures of the bluegrass region around Lexington. The limestone in the soil, by way of the grass, builds denser bone in horses raised on it. That is not folklore. It is verified animal science. It is also the reason that Kentucky, by the middle of the 19th century, was producing horses that the East Coast tracks could not match. Colonel Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., the grandson of the William Clark of Lewis and Clark, founded the Louisville Jockey Club in 1874. He had spent the previous summer traveling England and France, observing the racing infrastructure at Epsom, Ascot, and Longchamp, and he had returned to Kentucky with a specific architectural and procedural model in mind. He purchased 80 acres of farmland on the southern outskirts of Louisville from his uncles, John and Henry Churchill. He built a track, a clubhouse, and a grandstand. On May 17th of 1875, he held the first Kentucky Derby, modeled directly on the Epsom Derby, run at 1.5 miles, restricted to 3-year-olds. 15 horses ran. 10,000 spectators paid to watch. Aristides won. The race took a few seconds over 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Aristides, like every horse that ran in the Derby that day, descended from one or more of the 3 Arabian stallions imported into England 170 years earlier. He was, mathematically, a 5th-generation descendant of the Darley Arabian through eclipse. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover deep histories of money and gambling like this every week. By the early 19th century, English horse racing had a serious problem. The genetics had been refined, the breeding registers had been formalized, the Jockey Club had built a working set of rules, but the betting, which was the entire commercial engine of the sport, was unregulated, undocumented, and routinely fraudulent. The most famous demonstration of how unregulated that betting was occurred at the Epsom Derby on the 22nd of May, 1844. A horse named Running Rain crossed the finish line first, in front of a crowd of approximately 120,000 spectators. The horse's owner, an Epsom corn merchant named Anthony Wood, accepted the prize. The crowd, oddly, booed. The reason the crowd booed was that the horse who had crossed the finish line was not actually Running Rain. He was a 4-year-old colt named Maccabeus, originally bred in Yorkshire by Sir Charles Ibbotson, sold as a yearling to a notorious London gambler named Abraham Levi Goodman. Goodman had spent the previous 18 months disguising Maccabeus to resemble the real Running Rain, a younger horse, by, among other techniques, dyeing the colt's coat with a chemical mixture supplied by a London hairdresser. The Derby was a race exclusively for 3-year-olds. A 4-year-old, running against a field of 3-year-olds in a 1.5 mile race, has an enormous physical advantage. Goodman had placed bets on Running Rain at long odds. His expected payout, if the substitution worked, was approximately £50,000, equivalent in modern purchasing power to several $1 million. Goodman would have gotten away with it. He almost did. The Epsom stewards and the Jockey Club had received formal warnings about the substitution from Lord George Bentinck, a prominent racehorse owner and Member of Parliament who had been investigating Goodman's stable for nearly a year. Both bodies had refused to act. It was the owner of the second-placed horse, Colonel Jonathan Peel, brother of the British Prime Minister Robert Peel, who finally forced the case into court. Peel was a personal friend of Bentinck. Bentinck took charge of the investigation. He tracked down the hairdresser who had supplied the dye. He tracked down the trainer who had handled the real Running Rain. He produced, in the courtroom of Baron Edward Alderson on the 1st of July 1844, enough physical evidence to convince a special jury that the horse that had crossed the Derby finish line was Maccabeus running under a stolen name. Running Reign, actually Maccabeus, was disqualified. Orlando, the second-placed horse, was declared the winner. Goodman fled to France with his betting winnings and was never criminally prosecuted because no specific English law of the period addressed racing fraud as a discrete offence. The Solicitor General, summing up the case for the prosecution, called it a gross and scandalous fraud. Lord George Bentinck was presented with a £2,100 testimonial fund by grateful racehorse owners, which he used to establish the Bentinck Benevolent Fund for the families of trainers and jockeys, a charity that still operates in modified form to this day. The Running Rein case forced the first serious modernisation of racing regulation in English history. Horses were thereafter required to be physically inspected and certified before major races. The Jockey Club acquired the authority to disqualify and warn off offenders. The betting industry itself, however, remained a chaos of individual bookmakers operating with no central oversight, no clearing system, and no guarantee that they would actually pay out a winning bet. The solution to that came from Paris. Joseph Oller was a Catalan-born showman, gambler and entrepreneur who had moved to Paris in the 1850s and was, by the early 1860s, operating a small private gambling business on the Boulevard Magenta. On the 5th of March 1865, he loaded his portable betting wagon, brightly painted, designed to attract attention, onto the train and took it out to the racecourse at Champ de la Marche, where he sold tickets in denominations from 2 to 100 francs, on a pool basis, to anyone willing to bet on the day's outcomes. The pool system was, technically, illegal in France. Pure pool gambling was classified as a game of chance, which French law prohibited. In 1867, Oller solved the legal problem by modifying his system. He called the new version Paris Mutuel, literally mutual wagering. The bettor no longer bet against the house. The bettor selected a horse, contributed to a common pool, and received a proportional share of the pool if that horse won. Oller's commission was deducted from the pool before distribution. The system, Oller argued in his eventual court case, was not a game of chance, because the bettor's selection was based on knowledge of the horses, their breeding, their recent form, their condition on the day. The argument was thin, the market did not care. Paris Mutuel was an immediate commercial success. By 1873, Oller's Paris betting operation was turning over 5 million francs a year. By 1875, he had been arrested, tried, and sentenced to 18 days in prison for operating an illegal gambling enterprise. The system itself was officially banned in France. By 1891, with no actual replacement having emerged to fill the demand, the French government quietly legalized Paris Mutuel betting and made it the state-mandated form of racetrack wagering, which it remains to this day. Oller did not return to gambling. He turned to entertainment instead. In 1889, he co-founded an establishment in the Montmartre district of Paris, on the Boulevard de Clichy, called the Moulin Rouge. The man who reinvented horse racing's betting infrastructure went on, in his second career, to invent the modern Parisian nightclub. The Paris Mutuel system spread through continental Europe in the 1870s and 1880s. It crossed to Australia in the 1880s, where in 1913, an Australian engineer named George Alfred Julius installed the first mechanical totalizator, a device that automated the pool calculations and displayed them on a large board visible from anywhere in the racetrack. At Ellerslie Racecourse in Auckland, New Zealand, the tote board, as it came to be known, made large-scale Paris Mutuel betting workable for the first time. The United States adopted the system in 1927. By the middle of the 20th century, almost every major thoroughbred racing jurisdiction in the world, France, Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, Argentina, was running on Paris Mutuel pools rather than fixed odds bookmakers. Today, the global thoroughbred racing industry generates somewhere on the order of $115 billion annually in total wagering handle. depending on which jurisdiction's accounting methods are used. The Japan Racing Association alone handles approximately $35 billion in annual pari-mutuel betting. The Hong Kong Jockey Club, which operates only 2 racetracks but handles all legal sports betting in Hong Kong, contributes the single largest charitable trust in Asia from the proceeds of its racing pools, and the bloodstock at the center of this entire industry has never stopped narrowing. In 1981, a Dubai prince named Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who had been introduced to horse racing as a student in Cambridge in 1967, purchased Dalham Hall Stud in Newmarket, Suffolk, the historic capital of English thoroughbred breeding. He named his international racing operation Godolphin in 1992, after the 18th century earl whose name was already attached to one of the 3 foundation stallions. The Maktoum family, over the next 3 decades, became the largest single owner of thoroughbred bloodstock in the world. Their stallions stand at studs across England, Ireland, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Their broodmare bands run into the thousands. The genetic line that began in 1730 with a small bay stallion pulling a water cart through the streets of Paris, given as a diplomatic gift from a Tunisian bey to a French king who could not see its value, has, 300 years later, been bought back, at extraordinary expense, by a member of the modern Arab world that originally produced it. The Godolphin Arabian is buried at Wandlebury Park in Cambridgeshire, under a stone marker installed by the Earl of Godolphin in 1753. The Byerley Turk is buried somewhere on the grounds of Goldsborough Hall in Yorkshire, though the exact location has been lost. The Darley Arabian is believed to be buried at Aldby Park, in an unmarked grave. 3 horses, imported by accident, war, and theft, buried in 3 English country estates that today hardly anyone visits. The genetic engine of an industry that, every year, moves more money than most national economies. This is what horse racing is. It is not the hats. It is not the carnations. It is not the announcer calling the stretch run at Churchill Downs on the first Saturday in May. Those things are the decoration. The substance underneath them is one of the most efficient, most regulated, most genetically concentrated, and most quietly enormous gambling industries that human civilization has ever assembled. It runs on bloodlines that converge on 3 stallions imported by Englishmen who could not have imagined what they were starting. It runs on a betting system invented by a Catalan in a Parisian wagon in 1867. It runs, ultimately, on the same instinct that filled the Circus Maximus with 150,000 Romans 2,000 years ago. People will pay to watch horses run. They will pay even more to bet on which one wins. If this changed how you think about the sport, the video on screen right now goes deeper into another piece of gambling history hiding in plain sight.